Welcome to Now We're Getting Somewhere. I'm Katie, and I'm a certified life coach, but I've also been a management consultant at McKinsey and a product manager at a tech startup. In other words, I know what it feels like to have a life that looks pretty good on paper, but doesn't feel as good as I want it to. I help my professional clients develop lives that are more meaningful, happy, and also more successful. And I want to share the same practical insights with you. Let's go. Hey everybody, welcome to episode 8 of Now We're Getting Somewhere. Before we get to the meat of today's podcast, I wanted to share something that happened to me recently, which is team. I bought an e-bike. I'm so excited about this. I'm just telling basically anyone and everyone who's in my life. And I basically think that everybody needs an e-bike now. Like, I'm talking to my husband and I'm like, well, obviously you want an e-bike too. And he's like, Katie, not everyone is as obsessed with their e-bikes as you are. I have been waiting a really long time for this particular e-bike. I wanted this model that would be really good on hills, but also had space in the back for 2 child seats. So I could tote my children around town and pick one of my sons up at preschool and take both of them to their grandparents' house or whatever. And it's amazing. I just want to say that. I live in a hilly area. So I live in the northeast part of LA County, and it's very hilly. We're in the foothills of the mountains. And I really love biking whenever I'm sort of by the coast. I love being on a beach cruiser. And this e-bike is kind of built like a beach cruiser, but it powers up those hills. So I'm biking, but I'm also on an e-bike. I don't really like cars. Okay. I felt that I should share something true about myself that's not necessarily personal development related. So there we are. Now you know that about me. I love my e-bike. I have an e-bike now. It's amazing. Highly recommend. Okay, now let's get to the meat of today's podcast. One podcast listener who's also a newsletter subscriber and also knows me from a past life recently pointed out to me that while my podcast might be really great for people who are already familiar with me and my work, like people who kind of know my newsletter already or know me in some capacity, people who are new to my work might want to know a bit more about me. Like, who is this lady who has this podcast? I thought that was such a good point. And I realized that even on my newsletter or just on my website, I don't really have a very thorough description of my story. So that's what I want to do today. Share my story. And the funny thing about telling one's story, of course, is that there's so many different ways to tell it. I could tell a version of my life, which is all about my romantic journey, for example, the lessons I learned from various relationships, or my physical journey, the story of moving from Los Angeles to New Jersey to New York to North Carolina and back to LA. Of course, the most relevant version of my story, the version of that you probably care about the most, is the story about why I became a coach, and a bit more about my own journey of personal development. So this would be kind of the story of my quote unquote professional life, but also this story has a lot in it about my journey of personal growth and the realizations and changes I went through as a person. Because of course, my personal journey, the ways in which I changed that were frankly very surprising to me, those changes are ultimately the reason why I'm a coach today. So even if you've been following my work for a long time, I think this telling of my story will probably have more about me than I've shared before in any one place. And of course, if you're new to me and my work, oh my goodness, welcome, welcome, welcome. I hope this is helpful for you too. And it's funny, in prepping this podcast, I kept thinking to myself, oh my gosh, is this overly indulgent? Because it feels like a lot of sharing about myself. And even though I do try to share little bits and pieces of my experiences in my newsletter, and of course, I've already done that here on the podcast, I typically try to keep it pretty short because my work is not about me. It's about the lessons and insights that I can hopefully share with you. And honestly, I'm actually a pretty private person. But then I thought about myself and how I like to consume content. And if I like someone else's work, I love hearing more about them. I want to know their whole deal. I also felt like I bet my story has a lot of overlaps with your story. I mean, I have struggled with so many things, with knowing what I wanted in life, with my energy, with my eating, with wanting to be impressive. So I hope that all that I've struggled with helps you feel less alone. And I hope that the lessons that I've learned will be helpful to you too. And once I started getting prepped on this topic, I ended up with quite a lot of material. It just felt to me like energetically too much for one episode. So I divided all of my ideas into 2 episodes. So today I'm going to talk about some of my earlier young adult life and some of the big categories of things I struggled with. And one of my first kind of big breakthroughs, which was really the kernel of why I became a coach. And then we'll continue the story with more of my big kind of revelations that led me to become a coach in the next episode. So with that being said, let's get to my story. So I'm calling this first section of my story the before state. I think that every good story, one that's about change or growth, it has a before state. So I want to say a teensy bit about my childhood, and then I want to introduce you to high school Katie, who I feel like represents the before state in this story. I grew up in Los Angeles. My husband would point out that when I say this, I actually mean the county of Los Angeles, not the city of LA. I grew up in an east side suburb of LA called Arcadia, and I did most of my schooling in Pasadena, which is another suburb on LA's east side. My parents were both lawyers. They actually met at Stanford Law School, and it was always understood from a very young age that being academically successful was very important. I have 2 older brothers who were both quite successful academically, and I think that on a subtle, or probably honestly not that subtle level, I always wanted to do at least as well as them. I went to a private school for both middle school and high school, which I was very fortunate to have my grandparents pay for. And my high school in particular was this kind of very academically rigorous private school. And in retrospect, the thing that stands out to me about this time, and maybe you've had a season of your life that was like this, during this season of my life, my goals were crystal clear to me and I didn't question them for a second. It was just like, of course I need to be academically successful and get straight A's. Of course I need to get top scores on my APs and SAT2s and the regular SATs so I can have as many options for college as possible. Of course. Of course I need to also pursue extracurriculars, which in fairness I enjoyed, but of course I have to pursue them in a very intentional and frankly also rigorous way so that they will look good in a college application. Of course. And to be clear, I also just wasn't really a rebellious kid. So I kind of just did what my parents suggested and I was fairly successful at it and I felt good about being successful and everything kind of just fed into this virtuous cycle for what it was. And I will say as part of that, I did work very hard in high school. I did homework from the moment I got home from school, which was usually about 5. If I was in a play or a musical, which rehearsed after school, which I often was, I worked from about 5 with a very short dinner break until usually about 10:30 or 11 p.m. at night. There was basically no time for TV, no leisure internet. And I think just to illustrate this, because it still makes me laugh that I did this, I remember that my mom and I would watch Gilmore Girls together when I was in high school. My dad would get home from work later and my brothers were already in college, so it was just her and me for dinner. And I remember it was like, well, of course I don't have a full hour for television on a weeknight to spare. That would just be crazy. So we would record Gilmore Girls on our VCR, and then we would watch it in like 20-minute segments over dinner, over 3 nights. So I think that's just like a really perfect distillation of my life at the time. And it's interesting even telling this story because despite all this, I actually have pretty fond memories of high school, even though it was a very busy time and in some ways a very intense season. But I had friends, I dated a few nice guys, I had a lot of extracurriculars that I did really enjoy. I did a lot of theater and musical theater, and I also started a dissection club. You heard that right. We dissected things in the dissection club. I think we called it the Hands-On Bio Club. For whatever reason. Side note, did you know that there is a literal catalog for biology teachers where you can choose what you want to dissect and order it in the mail? I did not know this until I started the dissection club and we were given access to the catalog. Okay, but to be clear, I will also say as part of this, it wasn't like I was happy every single second. I would, of course, get overwhelmed by schoolwork, or there would be heartache about some guy with the intense green eyes who I had a crush on, who never seemed to notice me. But overall, I have pretty happy memories of this period of my life because I knew what success was. It was being academically successful and also being successful at extracurriculars and doing all these things to get into a good college. And I did those things. And, that was a very particular way of being in the world, knowing the goal, working hard towards the goal, having everything in my life support the goal, and then, of course, ultimately succeeding at the goal because I got into Princeton, which is my top choice school. So that's this very positive, frankly, fairly stable before state. that I wanted to sketch out for you. So with that, I just want to jump forward in time to where it all begins to break down. So I would call the next chapter of this story college. Things start to break down. Because there were three big ways in particular that things started to break down for me in college. One of them was knowing what I wanted. The second one was in my energy. And the third one was in my eating. So let's talk about each of them. So to start with knowing what I wanted, like I said, the first way in which my life started to really break down was that I started to really struggle to know what I even wanted. So as I said, growing up, the focus had been on doing well in high school. So I'll have lots of options for college. And then once I actually got to college, my parents, to their credit, I think, kind of backed off and let me and also my siblings as well find our own way. And I think that was the right move as parents, but it also kind of left me in this strange goal vacuum in my life. Like, what do I want if the goal doesn't just have to be really successful academically and extracurricularly? But the interesting thing about this goal vacuum was I definitely didn't realize that there even was a goal vacuum for a really long time. I didn't think to myself, wait, what do I want if I don't have to just want the things that my parents told me to want? I don't think I had the depth of self-awareness to really ask that question until much later. In fact, despite the fact that my parents were no longer kind of enforcing these values or goals, I didn't really think that I might even revise or rethink them. I just kind of continued to value the same things that I was taught to value in high school. So doing well academically, joining some extracurriculars, vaguely looking for other impressive opportunities to pursue in terms of internships or jobs after graduation. Then in college, you start to have to make decisions like choosing a major or what you'll do in the summer and eventually what you'll do after graduation. And I started to really struggle to know kind of what I even wanted in those decisions. One example of this is that I remember really agonizing over what I would major in. It felt like this big decision, and I remember making all of these pro-con lists and talking to my mom on the phone, feeling like I was going in all these different directions. And I also just remember that when I eventually did choose my major, I was what Princeton calls a politics major, which is basically political science or poli-sci anywhere else. When I finally made that decision, it honestly felt kind of arbitrary. I mean, I thought about it and I did have reasons, but also it kind of just felt like I need to make a decision by X date. So I made a decision. It wasn't this sense of, yes, I made this choice because I feel called to be a politics major, or I feel this profound sense of being attracted to this. It just felt like there was this deadline and my brain made a decision because it had to. Another example of this would be my internships between my college years. I did some things that were interesting. I interned at my local NPR affiliate here in LA one summer. Another summer I worked at the Department of Justice in DC. But every time, again, it kind of felt like I was just asking my brain, what would be interesting given my interests and simultaneously at least somewhat impressive, and then finding something that met that criteria. Another way of phrasing this would be that it felt like it was all this very cognitive decision making, which I was making just because I needed to make a decision in that moment, rather than something that came from my heart or my gut. It was never a decision that had real depth or rightness to it, which honestly are words that I would use now for most of my major decisions. And in retrospect, to be honest, if I had consulted my heart or my gut, I think I might have not had an internship at all. Honestly, and I'll talk about this in just a second, I think I was so tired that if I had really listened to myself, I probably would have just gone home and done nothing but read novels all summer. Like, I can feel in my body even now that I would have wanted more of that at the time. But of course, I would not have thought that was acceptable at the time. It would have felt like, these are important summers. You need to take full advantage. And this is related, but one thing I remember feeling frequently in college was that decisions came up too fast. There were too many decisions to make, too many big deadlines. You could never take as much time as you really wanted to, or on some level needed to really sit with the decision in the way I would have liked to. And that feeling too, that everything was in a rush, that you needed to make decisions on deadlines before you were necessarily on a bodily or a gut level really ready. I can totally feel in my body that kind of bodily felt sense and memory of that, even as I talk about it. I think a lot of my young life in general was doing that, making decisions, getting stuff done at a pace that would have been different than what I would have wanted if I had been in touch with my deeper self at the time. Though I also want to say, even as I say that of course, there's a lot of ways in which the actions that I took based on the reasoning that I had at the time, they did profoundly serve me later. I'm going to talk more about that in a bit. So on one hand, I feel really grateful to past Katie because she did some things that gave me future gifts. But I also feel very compassionate towards her for some of the ways that she moved through the world that were just not great for her. And they felt disconnected and they didn't really make her feel great. So that's the first way in which I struggled. I struggled to make decisions, especially ones that felt really right to me. The second way in which I struggled a lot was with my energy. I was pretty overstimulated and tired a really large amount of the time in college. And again, I wouldn't have put it in those terms at the time. I don't think I particularly often thought to myself, oh, I'm exhausted and completely overstimulated, though I did think that sometimes. But the one thing that I did consciously realize all the time was that I was constantly looking for quiet places to be alone. I had roommates, so I became this connoisseur of finding isolated places to hide and study. I'd go 3 floors underground in our campus's main library and find a random desk in a labyrinth of a stack of books just so I could be alone. And I remember also very clearly coming home on breaks from school and just holding up at my parents' house and basically not leaving. I didn't go out with friends. I just stayed home and rested. And I didn't even consciously realize why I was doing this at the time. But in retrospect, I'm like, oh my gosh, I was so tired. Of course, I never wanted to do anything when I had time off from school. It took me until my mid-20s to really understand that I was a huge introvert and that college, at least my college experience, was really just not set up for introverts versus, growing up and in high school, both of my parents just love reading and they love doing quiet activities alone in the evening. And I was lucky enough to have my own room, so I just do homework quietly by myself. All of that is really fantastic for an introvert. But college was it was kind of tiring and I was pretty overstimulated a lot. And I do want to make sure I say here, I'm really focusing on my struggles in college because I do feel like it was a time in which there were a lot of things that would eventually become my core challenges that really emerged then. But I will also say, of course, or maybe not of course, I will also say, to be clear, especially because probably people who knew me in college are listening to this, there was a lot of good to college. I was deeply involved with this student-written musical comedy group, which was called the Triangle Club. It was very silly and fun, and we did sketch comedy, and we had an all-male kick line, and we went on tour every year, though in retrospect, that was both fun and also, again, very exhausting for me. But I had really nice friends, and I dated a nice guy, so I did have a nice college experience in a lot of ways. But here, I'm just trying to talk about what were my core personal struggles and what eventually happened with them. And one of the things that happened with them is they influenced me in terms of becoming a coach. And energy, that was just a huge struggle of mine because, especially in college, because I really had to think about my energy for the first time in my life versus growing up in this very, very introvert-friendly household. And at the time, I didn't really get that a lot of what was happening to me was just that I was so exhausted so much of the time. So that's a bit more about me and energy in this season of my life. And then the third big area of challenge for me in college was my eating. Whereas the past two things that I just spoke about took me a while, honestly years, to really understand what was off. My eating was the thing that I even knew at the time was absolutely not working. The Cliff Note version of the story is that I started eating emotionally. I actually prefer the term compulsively in college. I didn't mention this when I shared about me in high school, but I was this kind of tall, slender teen. And part of that was obviously just growing a lot. I'm a very tall woman and being young. And part of that was also that my mom had passed on to me this kind of series of rules for relating to my eating in a way that would help me stay slender. And to be really fair to my mom, she's actually a very moderate person. She eats cookies and pizza and hamburgers and is also slender to this day. So her rules were more like a series of ways of making sure that you are thoughtful about your portions ultimately. And I know that she struggled with her weight as a young person. So a lot of why she taught me all of this was because she wanted to spare me some of the pain that she went through. But, I was a organized, slightly intense teenager, and these concepts really felt like rules to me. They felt like rules that I really needed to be careful about because I really, really didn't want to gain weight. And at the time, especially in high school, I was extremely careful with my eating. Yes, I had a sandwich, but I only had half of a sandwich. Yes, I had a cupcake, but I only had half of a cupcake. And look, I was slender. And just like this whole virtuous cycle of academics, it was like, I know the goal, stay slender. And I knew what to do, be very careful about my portions. And I just did it. And in high school, all of that kind of worked. And then in college, it just stopped working. I just stopped being able to follow what I sort of quote unquote knew I should do. Sometimes that looked like eating a little too much at a meal, a little more than I kind of really needed. And sometimes it looked like eating in a way that felt secretive or that felt like I was sort of eating quickly in private and feeling a little out of control with that brownie or those cookies. Eating in a way that I would now call bingey. And overall, just around my eating, there was definitely this feeling of out of controlness. Like, why can't I just do what I need to do to stay at the weight that I want to be at? It was very clear to me that I wasn't confused about what I should do. It was just that I wasn't doing it. And I was going against what I wanted to do, what I planned to do in all these big and small ways. And of course, if you're eating in this way, if you're eating too much in all of these big and small ways, you will inevitably gain weight. So I gained some weight and I felt upset about that. And I tried to control my weight more and then I couldn't. And then that kind of push and pull of attempted restriction led to more overindulgence in reaction. And it just felt really messy. Like it was, again, this kind of out of controlness for this person who typically didn't feel super out of control. And I really just could not extricate myself from it. And it felt really frustrating, to be honest, to be this person, again, who saw herself as smart, as together, as empowered in so many parts of her life, to feel kind of, at least at times, out of control and super messy and frankly embarrassed about this way in which I was eating. So I say all of that to kind of introduce you to me in college and into what I was struggling with at the time, because these things, knowing what I wanted, my energy and my eating, they all ended up being these really key points of transformation for me, really radical transformation for me in my life. So from here forward, I want to talk about a bunch of those transformations and how they led me to becoming the person and the coach, really, that I am today. So as I look forward to the next decade and a half of my life from this kind of late college period, I can see at least 3 big periods of transformation or change. I'm going to call them breakthroughs because they really felt like breakthroughs to me. And they felt like times when I was able to see the world in a radically different way, when the way that I moved through the world radically shifted for me. And that first breakthrough came for me without a shadow of a doubt in my eating. The breakthrough started, like so many do, with some internet research. It was spring of my senior year of college, and honestly, I think I was trying to research weight loss to see if there was something that I hadn't thought of that would help me lose the weight and get my eating under control. And somehow, someone on the internet who had lost a significant amount of weight recommended this book. It was called Breaking Free from Emotional Eating by Geneen Roth. And I remember the university library didn't have it, but the public library in town did. So I left campus and I checked it out and I went back to my dorm room and I laid down on my extra long twin bed to read it. And that moment, reading chapter 1 of Breaking Free from Emotional Eating on my extra long twin bed, I mean, that is just one of the moments that actually defines my life. I just remember reading the first few pages and my body just lit up. And I didn't really even understand somatic work back then, but I just still knew, oh man, this is me. What she is describing, this is absolutely my situation. I remember there were some paragraphs that would take me a really long time to read because I was just like, oh my God. And I'm not going to try to distill all the wisdom that Geneen Roth has to teach in this podcast. Though interestingly, I actually feel like she's a little out of fashion now for reasons that I don't 100% agree with, but that would take us down a far different conversational cul-de-sac than is relevant to this episode, but one of Roth's huge life-changing insights for me was that you should eat if you're hungry, and if you aren't hungry, you shouldn't eat. And on one hand, this is incredibly sensible. Like, don't eat if you're not hungry. Do eat if you are hungry. But nobody had ever explained it to me in such simple terms before. Like, it always felt to me like portions had to be controlled by your brain. You had to decide in your head how much you should eat and when you should eat and when you should stop. You couldn't trust your physical body to just tell you when to start or stop. And then, and this is where it gets really juicy, Roth would say that if you aren't hungry and if you are eating despite not being hungry, there is something else going on almost all the time. And you need to figure out what that thing is. And this may sound like a simple insight. And honestly, in relating it now, it sounds so completely obvious to me. But when I actually took that insight and undertook my first really in-depth self-observation, I found that I was constantly eating when I wasn't hungry. And even more strikingly, that there were tons of reasons that I was doing it that I had no idea about before I actually started looking. One of the reasons was that I was eating because I didn't want to work. It turned out that I would often, and it's crazy to me now that I didn't notice this at the time, but I really didn't. It turned out that I would often take breaks for meals just because I was tired of working and I wanted a break from working, and I wouldn't give myself permission to do it otherwise. Another reason that I was often eating was that certain people in my life made me uncomfortable. And this one, I remember so many times when I'd be in the middle of sitting at dinner with several people who were friends or friendly acquaintances, and I'd suddenly be like, oh my gosh, I am completely eating way past fullness. I was probably full half a plate ago. And then I'd excuse myself to go to the bathroom, which was my preferred place to think when I'm in a public place. And I'd be like, okay, self. I'd be sitting in the stall of the bathroom and I'd be checking with myself and saying, okay, what's happening? What's going on? And the answer would usually be, oh my gosh, something about my interaction with these people is making me feel uncomfortable. And at other times, I was eating because I was tired and overstimulated. I would be eating when I actually just wanted to be alone or in a quiet place. And certainly, though I didn't really have the language to better understand this until later, I would also just eat because my body felt agitated. Like if I was stressed about some test or some element of my thesis, which is this big capstone project you write at the end of your undergraduate experience at Princeton. And if at that time my body just felt jittery and jumpy, I would absolutely eat more, even though that, of course, was not solving the problem. And even talking about this, I mean, I'm sure all these things just sound incredibly obvious as I relate them. Like, yeah, Katie, obviously you shouldn't eat just because you don't want to work. But I genuinely had no idea I was doing this, that these things were affecting me in this way until I really started exploring my eating in this rigorous self-observation way. And I also want to say, this is something that if you follow my work, you've probably heard me say again and again, figuring all of this out, it was subtle information. It was hard to hear. Once I got better at it, that information would come faster. It would come more quickly. I'd be more likely to be able to do it in a crowded room. But in the beginning, it was a lot of just being like, oh my gosh, okay, something is happening with my eating. And then I would go to the bathroom and lock myself in the stall and I would breathe and ground myself and my body. And I would just try to figure out what was actually going on. So I say this to kind of emphasize that I really think that most of us can know more about ourselves. We can better understand why we do what we do and what we truly want and all of that. But we also need to understand that a lot of this stuff, it's really subtle. It's quiet. It comes in whispers. And just to return to the eating topic, once I started realizing all these things, it was like I suddenly had this direct line to a deeper part of myself than I had ever been able to access before. It also started to feel like listening to myself was one of the most important things to me, because I knew that it would show up in my eating if I didn't. I would overeat if I didn't listen to myself. And that insight and that prioritization started really changing all these ways that I showed up in the world. I started relating differently to my work. I started actually letting myself take breaks, far, far more breaks than I did before, because I just didn't want to keep eating too much. And I remember, as I said, I had a lot of these eating realizations in the spring of my senior year of college, which was when I was writing that senior thesis, which is, as I said, is this big capstone project of your undergraduate experience. It's like your first time doing real scholarly work, your own scholarly work. My thesis was over 100 pages. And I noticed that I was eating all the time just because I wouldn't let myself take a break. So one really funny manifestation of this shift in how I moved through the world was I actually read basically the whole True Blood series, which is like a vampire series, in the spring of my senior year, because I was just determined to not eat just because I needed a break. If I needed a break, I was going to take a break, but I was committed to not eating just to make the desire for a break go away. I also really started to notice how I felt about other people on a much deeper level. I would often think to myself, oh my gosh, there are these people who I thought I liked and I do like, but I don't like them in quite the same way as I thought. At minimum, my feelings towards them became more complex. And once I knew that, I started really sorting through the complexity of those feelings. I'll also say that I think this was the beginning of me starting to actually know what I wanted on a deeper level, because my eating became at minimum this kind of truth-o-meter. It would tell me what was true. It would tell me if I didn't like something, if I didn't want to do something. It would tell me if I was also going in the right direction, because I would feel totally relaxed and totally uninterested in food. And this was also the beginning of really making decisions for myself that had a feeling of depth, that feeling of rightness. Like, as I got better at this, I could start to feel, before I overate or before I ate when I wasn't hungry, there was always this feeling of agitation or this feeling of closed offness or this feeling of no in my body. And just even realizing that there could be a feeling of no in my body that wasn't just the yelling no, like the level 10 on a 10-point scale level of no, but there could be much more subtle versions of no. There could be a level 3 no or a level 4 or a 2.5. All of that was huge. And I started to also realize that there could be a somatic experience of yes, like I'm calm. I don't need to overeat. I can stop whenever I want. That was very powerful for me too. And I'm sure I will eventually do more episodes on my relationship with food and everything I've learned there. But another crazy result of this whole thing that I do need to share is that I actually developed the capacity to eat basically whatever I wanted, whatever type of food I wanted. And I stopped feeling out of control about food. I was just calm around food. I was confident that I could eat the amount that was right for me and that I could have muffins or pumpkin bread or chocolate or whatever, and it would all be fine. And this was, first of all, completely mind-blowing. And it was the beginning of being like, wait, what? Like, I could just listen to myself. I can just trust what feels good. The whole thing completely blew my mind and changed my life for the better. So that's my first really big life-changing breakthrough in the spring of my senior year. And then I graduated and I had this job lined up at McKinsey in New York. So I moved to New York and I started that. But for today, I'm going to stop there. I hope this has been helpful, and I hope you enjoy my next episode where I'm going to take you through the rest of my story, my next 2 breakthroughs, and how and why I became a coach. I'll see you there. If you really want to change in a meaningful, lasting way, that's when you need a life coach. Every client I've worked with has had incredibly personalized reasons why they're in the tired or anxious or stuck or uninspired state they're in. Working with me can help you identify those roadblocks, which are usually blind spots that you genuinely cannot see, and implement a profoundly customized, doable plan for overcoming them. I have a very small, high-end, one-on-one coaching practice. If you'd like to be my next client, reach out at katiesiever.com. I'd love to meet you.